I don't know Steven Hillenberg. I don't know anything about Steven Hillenberg. At no point in this video am I gonna act like I knew this man personally. Like he was my best friend, he was like a family member or something like that. Steven Hillenberg was my dad. No, there's nothing like that in this video at all. I know a lot of people like to do that when it comes to the SpongeBob related stuff that's come out since his death in November of 2018, but I'm not one of those people. I don't do that. I'm not going to develop a parasocial relationship with this man. I'm not going to put words into the mouth of a dead man who didn't even know about my existence when he was still alive. I just don't do that at all. This video is about what I think of the Sandy Cheeks movie. It's not about what Steven Hillenberg thinks of the Sandy Cheeks movie. We have no way of knowing what Steven Hillenberg thinks of the Sandy Cheeks movie, and we will never know at all. Maybe he would have been supportive of this movie, I don't know. Allegedly, he was aware of and approved the infamous Camp Coral spin-off, according to people that were actually close to him. People that actually knew him, and not random people on the internet. So who knows what he would have thought of this movie. Regardless, at no point in this video am I gonna be like, oh, Steven would have hated this, Steven would have hated that. I don't know Steven Hillenberg. I don't know what he would have hated and what he would have liked. I don't know if he would have wanted this or if he didn't wanted this or anything like that. I don't know. Steven Hillenberg made a show that I love and I forever respect him for that. But that's it. I know nothing else about this man. And I never will know anything about him. Because he's dead. And don't get me wrong, his death was very tragic. I still remember where I was on that fateful day in November 2018 when I learned of his passing. It hit me hard back then, and it still hits me hard almost 6 years later. It's not fair that Dan Schneider has officially outlived Steven Hillenberg. The fact that Steven Hillenberg gets taken away from us while Dan Schneider still gets to walk this earth is just a cruel f***ing joke, seriously. I know that ironically enough, that's a pretty parasocial thing for me to say about Steven, but it's not wrong, is it? None of y'all are gonna try and defend Dan Schneider now, are ya? Is that really what you want to do? Seriously. It's tragic that Steven Hillenberg is no longer with us, but there is nothing that any of us could do about that. I don't know what he would have thought of this movie, because number one, he's dead, and number two, I didn't personally know him, which is why I'm not going to bother bringing him up that much with this video. Whatever problems I have with this movie, whatever criticisms I give to this movie, it's gonna have nothing to do with Steven Hillenberg. It's gonna have nothing to do with what he would have wanted, what he would have not wanted, what he would have loved, what he would have hated. Nothing to do with that at all. I don't know Steven Hillenberg. And I never will. Now that we've gotten the elephant in the room out of the way, let's move on to the main topic of this video. I have a bit of an interesting history with SpongeBob in a way. The first 3 seasons are undeniably classics. Of course I grew up with them. The first movie from 2004 is also a classic as well. A lot of people believe that the SpongeBob movie should have been where the show ended, and surprisingly, there are still people out there that believe that, but I disagree strongly with that, as I think seasons 4 and 5 are criminally underrated and they should get a lot more respect. There are so many great episodes in seasons 4 and 5 that I have to question why they are considered the point where SpongeBob started going downhill. Then again, in recent times I've seen people say that season 4 in retrospect should be considered part of the show's golden age, so you know what, slowly but surely nature is healing. And then you have the 3 Dark Age seasons, in which season 6 is the only one that I'm mostly familiar with. In retrospect, I classify season 6 as a guilty pleasure season. I don't know if it's just because of nostalgia. There's undeniably a noticeable downgrade going from seasons 4 and 5 to season 6, but I don't hate season 6 for some reason. I think there are enough good episodes in season 6 that elevated up to, like, I don't hate it. I don't think this is when SpongeBob became the worst thing ever. nothing like that at all. Seasons 7 and 8 I'm a lot less familiar with, but that's just because I started to grow up and I didn't really care about the show as much. Season 9 of the show, I guess you could say, was like the last time I really cared about the show. The last episode I really remember having any interest with was this episode with a cat. I don't remember at all. I think it was from this season. This was around 2013 to 2014, and then I just moved on from the show. And not because the show had become bad, but because I just simply grew up. Well, okay, maybe I could have worded that a little bit better, but I just mainly focused on other things. Going from the early 2010s to the mid 2010s, I started to care less about Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network and whatever, and I started moving on to other things. I did watch Sponge Out of Water in theaters, and I thought it was a pretty good movie. It's obviously nowhere near as good as the first movie. The first movie is a classic, but you know what? I thought this was a pretty good movie. Apparently after that, Steven Hillenberg would come back to the show. He left the show after the first movie came out, and so he would return in the second half of the 9th season, where he would remain on the show until his tragic death in late 2018. I remember back during this time in the late 2010s, I saw people say that like SpongeBob was good again, SpongeBob has like a redemption arc or something, a return to form for the serious, you know, the SpongeBob Renaissance, revival, whatever. People liked SpongeBob again. Modern SpongeBob was good now all of a sudden. And by this point, I didn't care about Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network nowadays. I mean, obviously, you know, I still remembered like the older stuff, you know, older SpongeBob, old Nickelodeon shows, you know, stuff like that. But I didn't care enough about like whatever they were doing now in 2016, 2017. On extremely rare occasions, I would watch episodes from this revival era of the show, but overall I think it's easier for me to say that I'm just not familiar with how the show is nowadays. And I mean like nowadays. I know it might seem hard to believe, but season 6 was 16 years ago. Season 6 is closer in time to season 1 than to 2024. It's not exactly modern SpongeBob anymore. It feels redundant to call it that now in 2024. But I feel that I've delayed the inevitable long enough. Let's talk about the main topic of this video. The new and widely criticized Sandy Cheeks movie that recently came out on Netflix. Now, I'm very well aware that prior to this movie properly coming out in August on Netflix, the entire movie was leaked all the way back in January of this year on Twitter. I never got around to watching the movie when it was initially leaked, and I wouldn't watch it until after it was officially released onto Netflix. From what I've heard, there are basically no differences between the leaked January version of the movie and the final August version of the movie. So it's not like there's any novelty in having like an alternate unfinished version of this movie or anything like that. When this movie first got leaked, I remember seeing people say, "What the f*** is this? This is what SpongeBob is nowadays? This sucks." And once the movie was released onto Netflix and people were officially allowed to talk about it, I saw a lot more people echo that statement. After sitting through movies like Madam Web and Borderlands, I was just ready to see what kind of movie I would get out of the Sandy Cheeks movie. And what I would end up getting was complete and utter cheeks. Something that I noticed almost immediately after going into this movie was that this movie felt very dumbed down. Like this was very explicitly a movie made for really young kids. And this wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing if it weren't for the fact that SpongeBob is mostly a show that anyone could enjoy. Yes, the target audience for SpongeBob is generally kids, but the older episodes of the show could still be enjoyed by basically anyone of any age. A kid could watch Pizza Delivery or Chocolate with Nuts and they would find those episodes funny. A teenager and an adult could watch those episodes as well and they would also find them funny. Even though, yes, SpongeBob is generally a show for kids, they're the main demographic for the show, it still has this universal appeal. Anyone of any age can enjoy SpongeBob. And so it doesn't make sense watching this movie and it's like, this is very clearly a movie made for for like 5-year-olds. That universal appeal that SpongeBob generally has, it's not present in this movie. And I'm not even just saying like, oh, the pre-movie seasons are the only ones that are like this. No. Even seasons 4 and 5 could be enjoyed by teenagers and adults as well. They didn't feel dumbed down for kids. Maybe not even the Dark Age seasons are like this, you know? They didn't feel as dumbed down for kids as this movie does. It makes even less sense that this movie feels like it's for babies, considering the fact that most SpongeBob fans nowadays are teenagers and adults that grew up with the classic episodes all the way back in the early 2000s. There ain't any kids that are watching SpongeBob nowadays. So the plot of this movie revolves around Sandy Cheeks and SpongeBob entering the real world in order to save the entirety of Bikini Bottom. The entire city of Bikini Bottom had been kidnapped and put into this water park laboratory place, I don't know, that Sandy apparently used to work for before she moved to Bikini Bottom. The main villain of this movie wants to turn the inhabitants of Bikini Bottom into these toy pet hybrids, I guess, feeding them artificial Krabby Patties and then cloning them and then selling them for kids to play with. They're living sea creatures, but kids could play with them like normal toys in the air despite that. Very bold of Nickelodeon to assume that kids nowadays still care about SpongeBob. Kids nowadays still play with toys. You know, that's very bold of them to assume that. This whole like anti-consumerist message that this movie has, which is just completely out of nowhere and unfitting for this movie, is also made largely ironic, seeing how Nickelodeon has been doing the exact same thing with SpongeBob for the last couple of years. And ever since the release of Quiet on Set, I feel like they're going to be doing it even more. More than ever before, Nickelodeon is going to be relying heavily on SpongeBob, because SpongeBob is the only reason why Nickelodeon doesn't have a 100% terrible, irredeemable reputation. I used to make a lot of jokes before in the past about how when the Loud House came out, everyone was like, oh, this is gonna be a new golden age for Nicktoons. We're gonna start getting more good Nicktoons now because of the Loud House. And then the Loud House would instead become another cash cow that Nickelodeon would milk alongside SpongeBob. But nowadays, I'm not even sure if that's true. I don't think Loud House is raking in the money as much anymore. And then you combine that with Quiet on Set, and yeah, Nickelodeon has to rely on nothing else except SpongeBob now. So this whole like anti-consumer message that this movie has, not only does it feel weirdly out of place, but it's just ironic and hypocritical given how Nickelodeon has treated this show. I also seem to notice that every SpongeBob movie has been a road trip movie in a way. I'm not sure why they're unable to come up with other ideas for SpongeBob movies, because it seems like every single one of them so far, except for the second movie, is a road trip movie. The first movie, you have SpongeBob and Patrick going to Shell City to get the crown. The third movie, you have SpongeBob and Patrick going to Atlantic City. I don't remember. It was like a corny pun like that in order to save Gary. And in this movie, you have SpongeBob and Sandy going to Texas in order to save all of Bikini Bottom. It's like, could they not come up with another storyline for SpongeBob? Is this the only storyline template that they could think of when making a SpongeBob movie? Like, I don't get it. It worked perfectly with the first movie, and then the second movie was actually, like, different in terms of its plot, so I don't understand why they're just like, nah, let's just redo the first movie again and again. Oh yeah, this movie also has a Sandy Cheeks' family in it, and it turns out that her family is this, like, she has this circus family, and so most of the movie is just SpongeBob and Sandy driving to this water park place with Sandy's circus family. And by the way, the gas pedal for Sandy's family car looks like this, because of course it does, you know. This is a Nickelodeon movie, so of course the gas pedal looks like this. What else could it possibly look like, you know? You can get rid of the man, but you can't get rid of the idea. This is the one time I'll allow y'all to say Steven would have hated this. Speaking of which, I actually don't really have much of a problem with this movie introducing Sandy's family. I mean, these aren't great characters or anything like that. They're not particularly amazing characters, but there's a 99% chance that this movie is the only time that they will ever appear, so it's like there's not really much of a point in criticizing them. And again, I'm not gonna say something along the lines of, oh, Steven would have hated this. Steven Hillenberg was my dad, and he told me he would have hated it if Nickelodeon showed Sandy's family. Because again, I did not know the guy. And I never will. This movie reminds me so much of Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate in the sense that, like, this is a movie that's clearly made for an extremely young demographic, but it doesn't work because the people that love the older episodes of SpongeBob and the people that love the first Megamind are, like, older people. The people that love Megamind, the people that wanted Megamind to get a sequel, are those that grew up with the first Megamind as kids when it came out in 2010. And likewise, it's the same thing with SpongeBob. Again, most of SpongeBob's fans are teens and adults that grew up with the show's golden era in the early 2000s. So it makes almost no sense as to why these two feel explicitly dumbed down for an extremely young audience. More than anything else, I think this movie is extremely generic, which is something that SpongeBob should never be. Part of why the pre-movie episodes are so universally beloved is because of how unique they are. They stand out amongst the crowd of 2000s cartoons. And that's again in part because of the universal appeal that these episodes have. They could appeal to anyone. Anyone of any age could find these episodes funny, even if the main target audience are kids. And that's what gives SpongeBob the longevity that it has. So when you give us this movie that feels explicitly like a movie made for babies, it's going to feel off because, again, most SpongeBob fans are teens and adults that grew up with the show in the early 2000s. The cocomelonification of SpongeBob is something that most people watching this movie will not feel comfortable with. And to be honest, I don't even think kids would find this movie all that funny either. It's not even just the obvious elephant in a room, Gen Alpha watches brain rot stuff. There's also the fact that, like, this movie doesn't feel like it would appeal much to kids. Like, if I showed this movie to a kid, they would likely not find it funny, because it feels too dumbed down. It's super generic and bland, which is again something that you would never expect from SpongeBob. That is something that SpongeBob should never be. Even at its lowest points, you wouldn't call SpongeBob bland or generic. This movie feels outdated. I don't know how I could be able to further elaborate on that, but this doesn't feel like a movie that would come out in 2024. And you know what? Maybe I'm taking this stupid kids movie a little too seriously. Maybe I'm examining it a little too much, but I don't care. This feels like a TV movie that Nickelodeon would air in like 2012 and not a Netflix movie that would come out in 2024. You could put this movie next to like the live action Fairly Odd Parents trilogy and it would fit in perfectly. It wouldn't stand out at all. The whole time I'm watching this and I'm thinking, this is a movie from 2024? Cause it sure as hell doesn't feel like it. I wasn't expecting the same theatrical quality that the other three SpongeBob movies have, but I'm still surprised by how cheap this movie feels. Watching this movie, it doesn't feel like SpongeBob. It feels like a shell of what SpongeBob used to be. All of the clever jokes and writing that the older episodes had that anyone could enjoy in addition to kids, they're just gone in this movie. And so what you're left with is a movie that doesn't really appeal to anyone. Who is this movie for? It's supposed to be a movie for kids, but I don't think there's any kid that would watch this movie and find it funny, on account of the fact that, again, kids don't watch SpongeBob nowadays. The people that watch SpongeBob mostly are teenagers and adults that grew up with the show in the early 2000s, but they're not going to find this movie very good because of how dumbed down it is. And so it just leaves you wondering, who the hell is this movie supposed to be for? Probably the weirdest thing is that even though this is very clearly a movie made explicitly for young kids compared to most other SpongeBob media, there are a few attempts, I guess, to appeal to the older SpongeBob fans. From time to time in this movie, there are like references to the earlier episodes thrown in. Like there's a scene early on in the movie where you have the My Leg guy appear and he says his iconic line, and then a little bit after that there's a scene where his other leg gets hurt and he's like, oh, my other leg, and like it's not funny at all. What's usually a funny audible gag is now just something, it feels forced, you know? It thinks, oh, we have the funny thing that people like, without understanding why it was funny. That means people are going to like it. Near the end of the movie as well, there's a scene where all of the characters are trying to get wires to build something, and you could hear Patrick say, is mayonnaise a wire? Get it, guys? It's like the thing he said in that one episode, you know? That one funny meme line that he said. Guys, that's so hilarious and funny. See, we people at Nickelodeon, we're still funny, we're still cool, you guys still like us. Please forget about Quiet on Set. Something that I've noticed people criticize the modern SpongeBob episodes for, as in like the post Sponge Out of Water episodes, in order to make it easier to distinguish, is the fact that nowadays the really modern SpongeBob episodes heavily rely on like references and just stuff from the pre-movie episodes. I believe they made an entire episode based on the My Leg running gag, for example. I think Bubble Bass appears more frequently throughout the show. Nosferatu from Graveyard Shift, Doodle Bob, I know they appear from time to time. And it all just comes off like it's desperate, you know? A desperate attempt to relive the show's golden age. Why waste time creating new iconic moments when you can instead just rehash the old iconic moments? I wouldn't be surprised if eventually people started to slightly reevaluate the Dark Age seasons of the show, because at least they were different from the pre-movie seasons. They weren't trying to be like the pre-movie seasons, they were their own thing. People would criticize season 6 for not being like the pre-movie episodes, but I think that's kind of a good thing in a way, actually. If season 6 tried to be like the pre-movie seasons, it would be so much worse, I promise you. It's times like this where I'm glad that my profile picture is from not only a Dark Age episode of the show, but also from what is widely regarded as the worst season of SpongeBob. Thank goodness for that. I'm glad that Who Put You on the Planet is not from a pre-movie episode, because otherwise I know for a fact that it would be milked to death non-stop in the new episodes of the show. Okay, I'll give this movie a little bit of credit. There are 2 funny scenes in this movie, and that's it. There's a scene early on in the movie where SpongeBob and Sandy are on the wing of an airplane and SpongeBob is roasting a hot dog. No, I'm not gonna elaborate on the context or anything like that. And just as SpongeBob is about to eat the hot dog, he gets this vision of Squidward. The hot dog reminds him of Squidward's nose, and so he hallucinates Squidward's head in front of him, and Squidward's like, why? And no disrespect to Roger Bumpus or anything like that, but it sounds so phoned in, the why. And so like SpongeBob is sad now because he misses his friends, and it's like, it made me laugh because of how like surreal it was. Just the phoned in why from Squidward, it made me laugh. So, you know, there's one funny moment in the movie, I'll give it credit for that. The only other funny scene in this movie is near the end, where the villain is giving her backstory as to why she's evil. When she was a little girl, she loved fish, and she wanted to cuddle with them, pet them, you know, like you would a normal animal. She's shown stealing a sea creature and keeping it to herself, only to then eventually have the sea creature die because they cannot breathe in the air. And that's why she wants to turn the inhabitants of Bikini Bottom into these toy pet hybrids, sea creatures that can breathe in the air and can be played with akin to like a normal toy. For whatever reason, they decide to juxtapose her head onto like a little girl's body, and it's like every time it moves, it looks so bad, and it makes you question, like, how the hell did they approve of this? How did they look at this and think, yeah, this looks great, keep it in the movie? I'm showing images of it because I can't show any footage because of copyright reasons, but that's not doing it justice. You have to see it to believe it. You have to actually go out of your way to watch this movie in order to see how bad it looks. Because believe me, it looks bad, but it's like hilariously bad. Well, it's hilariously bad if it was unintentional. If this was intentionally made to look terrible, then, well, it's not funny anymore. This is only funny if it's unintentional. Unfortunately, it looks so terrible that it feels more likely that this was done intentionally, because again, there is no way they could look at this and think, yeah, this looks good. They most likely made it look intentionally bad for comedic purposes, even though ironically enough, it's funnier when it's unintentionally bad. So this may or may not be the only other funny moment in the movie, depending on whether this scene was intentionally made to be bad or not. And that's about it. The rest of the movie is just completely devoid of funny jokes. Most of the movie feels like it's trying to appeal to an audience that doesn't care about SpongeBob and completely ignoring those that still care about this franchise, when they could have easily had this be a movie that anyone of any age could enjoy, like with older SpongeBob. I brought up earlier that this movie reminds me of Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate, and I think this movie is even more, like, insufferable in comparison. I don't know what it is, but there's just something about this movie that's just, ugh, you know? Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate is at least a tiny bit of a funny bad movie, like maybe like 1%, 2% funny bad. This movie, on the other hand, is just boring. It's forgettable. This movie doesn't feel like it has any reason to exist, and yet it exists. And this is far from the last SpongeBob movie that we're getting. We're getting a fourth proper theatrical movie next year in 2025. Let me guess, it's going to be another road trip movie, because for whatever reason, these people cannot think of other ideas for a SpongeBob movie. They nailed this idea perfectly with the first movie, and then the second movie, they actually decided to do something different, and then for all the subsequent movies, they're like, nah, let's just rehash the first movie again. Apparently, there's also a Netflix Plankton movie that's coming out. I'm guessing they're starting to make these Netflix SpongeBob movies now. Like, they're gonna start making more of these for, like, other characters. I could be wrong on this, but I think at one point they announced that they were doing, like, a Squidward movie. I have no idea, though. Gotta milk the cash cow, I guess. Quiet on set heavily damaged our reputation, so now more than ever before, we gotta rely on our one cash cow. We're reaching milking levels that were thought to be impossible, baby. But yeah, there's supposed to be a Plankton movie coming out next year, and apparently it's already been leaked online, just like the Sandy Cheeks movie, so I have no idea what the hell is going on with Netflix's security. Perhaps the most baffling thing of all is apparently this Plankton movie is actually not that bad when compared to the Sandy Cheeks movie. I've yet to watch it, so I cannot verify that, but, you know, if it's good, if it's better than this movie, then hey, there's that at least. But yeah, to wrap things up, this movie is like the complete antithesis of what SpongeBob usually is. Instead of being a funny, creative, clever show that is meant to be for kids, but could also be enjoyed by anyone of any age, it's just generic slop made exclusively for kids. But I don't think even kids would find this movie all that funny. This is easily the worst SpongeBob movie. Well, at least the worst SpongeBob movie so far. The first movie is an undeniable classic. The second movie is actually pretty good. The third movie is not good, but at least it has gorgeous animation. This movie has nothing. It's trash is what it is. Is this the lowest point for SpongeBob? Is this SpongeBob's nadir? I don't know. That's very debatable. In a way, I kind of want to say it is, because SpongeBob should not be this generic, soulless thing. This movie doesn't feel like SpongeBob. It just feels like a shell of its former self. I probably shouldn't be expecting much, especially since it's been 25 goddamn years since this show came out. It's like complaining about how The Simpsons is bad nowadays, or how Family Guy is bad nowadays. Like, at some point you just kind of accept that, yeah, these shows aren't that good anymore. But still, to see SpongeBob fall off this hard, you know, seeing it go from being this timeless show that anyone could enjoy to this easily disposable slop for very young kids, it's sad to see. This has nothing to do with Steven Hillenberg at all. If Steven Hillenberg was still alive and he was personally involved with this movie, it would still be garbage. So, when are we gonna reevaluate One Course Meal? I wanna know. Feel like that's long overdue, but I don't know. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Adios.